There's an old story that allows a significant question to be asked of us. It's the story about that king who oftentimes would dress in disguise to go out into the streets of his kingdom to see how people were faring. One very humid night, when he'd been tossing and turning, he got up and dressed himself in his peasant's garments, and he went out into the streets to wander. But as he was wandering about the town, he happened to see a light in a window of a tiny little cottage at the end of a small cul-de-sac. So he wandered down there, and he was able to look in the window, and there, by the candlelight, there was an old man and an old woman drinking from a carafe of wine and eating a simple meal of bread and cheese. So he knocked on the door, and when it was opened by the old inhabitant, he stated that he was a weary traveller, and so he was invited in and asked to join their simple repast. But he found that around that little table there was an air of celebration, so the conversation was quite lively and upbeat, you might say. But then the king in disguise asked the question of the old man, how do you sustain yourself? What is it that you do to make a living so that you can put food on your table at night? And the old man said, well, I'm a cobbler, and in the daytime I take my tools and I go out into town to see if anyone needs their shoes repaired, and in this way I'm able to make a simple living to sustain myself and my wife. And after that the king asked, well, I see that you don't have any children, so what about when you're old and you cannot work anymore? And the old man spoke very firmly, and he said, we do not follow any faith, but we have faith that there is a power that has been with us all our life. Now the king was very impressed with the authority that this old man spoke. And so that very night when he took his leave and asking the old couple, can I come and visit you again? And receiving the confirmation that he'd be welcome at any time, the king went back to his palace, and early the next morning he sent out criers into the town to say that no one was allowed to be a cobbler in town anymore. No one was allowed to repair shoes in his kingdom. So when the old man got up and took his tools and went into town, he heard that of course he could not ply his trade. So how could he earn enough money to put food on his table? But just then he noticed other beings carrying water. So he thought to himself, well, I can become a water carrier because the well is outside town, and I can carry this water into town. So, trading in his little toolbox, he bought himself some buckets. And so he became a water carrier, and in this way he was able to make enough to buy his bread and cheese and his wine. Well, that very night the king in disguise came back to his house and again was welcomed by the old couple. And when they were sitting around the table, the disguised king said, well, what are you doing now that the king put out an edict that you could not be a cobbler anymore? And the old man said, well, I've become a water carrier. and in this way I was able to earn enough coinage to provide for our needs. So the king again, still being impressed by this old man and what he said was his faith, the very next morning he put out an edict and sent around cries that no one was allowed to carry water in the town. So when he came out with his buckets, he found that he could no longer be a water carrier. So he noticed that there were some wood choppers with axes over their shoulders going out of town to the forest nearby. So he decided that this was a way he could earn money. So he sold his buckets and bought himself an axe, and he followed the wood choppers out of town, and he was able to chop wood and bring it in to serve the people's needs, to fire their wood fires. So again the king visited him, and again in conversation asked him, how are you faring now that the king has said you can't? And the old man said what he was now doing, that he was able to make a living chopping wood. So of course the king, now on a mission to test this old man and his faith, he put out an order that no one was allowed to chop wood anymore. So when the old man went into town, he wasn't allowed to chop wood anymore. But the king had also put out a call that people were, the able-bodied men, no matter what age they were going to be conscripted to be guards of his palace. So, as it happened, the old man was in town when they came around gathering these men, and so he was taken to the palace, and he was given a uniform and a sharp sword, and given the task of standing outside the king's palace to guard the gates and so forth. So the old man was quite happy about this because he had an occupation, but then he found that the guards at the palace were only paid once a month, and he was conscripted into being a guard at the beginning of a month. So he had no money in which to sustain himself and his old wife. What was he to do? So the old man thought to himself, well, this is a very valuable sword. So he took his sword and he sold it in the marketplace. So he had enough money to buy food to sustain him. But after selling the sword, he went back to his house, and of course, having a very sharp knife, being a cobbler, he managed to whittle a piece of wood in the shape of the sword so that it would appear that he still had the sword in his hilt when he was standing on guard. But the very next day, while he was standing out in guard outside the palace gates, the king had sent out messengers to gather everyone in the town together, because there was to be a thief who was to be beheaded. And he wanted this to be an example to everyone, but he also had another plan, because of course he knew that the old man had been conscripted to be a guard outside his gates. So the dais was set up, and the king and his entourage were standing there, and the so-called guilty man was brought up to the dais. And then the king gave the order And pointing to the old man, he said, and it is he who is going to be the executioner. So the old man was brought up onto the dais with the task of lopping the head of this so-called thief. So there came a moment when the old man stood up on that dais, confronted with the task of lopping a man's head. And at that moment, the old man stood up and, speaking loudly to the crowd, he said, "Oh, great power that has been with me all my life, you know that I have never killed another man. But if this man is guilty, may my sword be sharp and true. But if he is innocent, may my sword have been turned to wood." And taking his wooden sword out of its sheath, he lifted it up in front of the crowd, who cheered roundly. Now the king, no longer needing to test the old man's faith, said, "I want and need you in my palace as my advisor. I know not what your faith is, but I now take you as my most leading advisor and consultant." So you know the question that arises from this story. Coming to a place where we can acknowledge and embrace that we know, and we know that we have the proper authority, recognizing that there has been something in our life that has allowed us to prevail. A power, a force that has brought us to this place where we can claim, acknowledge and embrace, knowing that we know, knowing that we have the authority. But the question is, what is the name of this power? What name will we give this force that's been in our life, that's allowed us to prevail, to rise above the challenges, the shatterings, the vicissitudes, the trials, the tests that have been along the way? What's its name?
I still call it faith. I call it faith like he does.
Faith.
For me it is. I don't know how.
But faith is, we know, like trust in those other words. But claim it as our own.
God, God's self, isn't it? It's like that spirit of. It's hard to put a name on it, but it's like our God self.
Yes.
That,
Yes.
that little voice within.
Yes.
Which,
And why do we have to give it a name? If we call it faith and trust and those other words, it leaves the mind with the need to establish something to have faith and trust in. So how do we claim it for ourselves as something that is there to be celebrated every day, something that's with us 24/7, knowing that in any given moment, whatever response that's needed, it's there.
it's just acknowledgement.
Yes.
What'd you say?
Acknowledgement.
Can we give it a name?
I call it inner guidance, my inner guidance.
Yes.
Divine light.
Divine light, yes.
Who we are.
Who we are. Okay. I'll never forget, and if you don't mind if I tell you a story, Hacker?
You can do, yes.
Hacker had not been to visit before. Many, many years ago, he said, I want to go and visit Pat on my birthday because I think she's going to be able to tell me my real name. And so on Hacker's birthday, he came riding up the driveway on his old motorbike, chopping up the driveway. And when he came in, he stepped off his bike and took off his helmet, and he said, on the way here, nobody could hear me, but I shouted in Rama, Rama, Rama. So I said to him, okay, now you know what's your name.